You came a long way from St. Louis. You climbed the ladder of success. I've seen the flashy foreign cars that were parked out in front of your fancy address. You came a long way from St. Louis. A long way from St. Louis in the show me state of Missouri, all the way down here to the sunshine state of Florida for yet another edition of the Radioactive Take with me, Brian Steibel, a commercial news talk radio host of some accomplishment over the years. I've worked at a number of stations before a number of audiences, usually in the late night portion of the broadcast day, but I've worked around the clock and around the country. And yeah, I'd rather be on the radio, I admit that. But this isn't a bad second choice, this YouTube thing that sooner or later I'll get the hang of, but not quite just yet. But it is WBQS News Talk Radio, a station that doesn't exist, but ought to, as we propagate conversation at the speed of light, kicking around the culture and offering news and commentary with an old school style. That's what we aim for, at least. RadioactiveSeattle@gmail.com is where we can be reached, but I'd rather have you just watch me here on YouTube. We do it 5 nights a week, and we'll continue doing it as long as I've got the energy. And I'm a pretty energetic guy, if you haven't noticed already, so I expect to be here a long time, and I'm delighted that you're in the audience as we try to grow this narrowcast, as I call it, here on Wednesday, the 16th of August, 2023. I want to talk this edition of the Radioactive Take about a couple of music personages who died on the 16th of August. One today, that would be Jerry Moss. Now, you may not know that name. I barely did, but everybody knows his label because the Moss of Jerry Moss was the M in A&M Records. You've heard of them, the A being Herb Alpert, he of the Tijuana Brass. Alpert and Moss got together and formed A&M Records, and A&M Records happened to be the site of one of the most important recording sessions in rock history. That would be the We Are the World session in the spring of 1985. We talked about that the other day on the Radioactive Take because I managed to con my way. Well, I had a tip. Somebody at Rolling Stone magazine said, hey, there's a press conference on it wasn't the morning after, it was the afternoon after the We Are the World session, which took place on a Monday night into the wee hours of the morning. Probably by dawn it was finally when they wrapped. And this was all after the American Music Awards. And Bob Geldof took advantage of the fact that so many people, so many important recording artists were in the audience there, and some of them on the stage getting awards, that he managed to get together with Ken Kragen, who was the guy behind the Hands Across America thing that you may recall, that actually was a part of as well. We'll talk about that on one of these editions of the Radioactive Take. But Ken Kragen and Bob Geldof, who would later follow up the We Are the World session with the Live Aid concerts, the 2 concerts first in England and then there in Philadelphia that comprised Live Aid on the 13th of July, 1985. But before that happened, they got together for We Are the World, and they held it right there at A&M Records, which is just a block or so, if that, on the west side, I want to say, of Fairfax in Hollywood, just about a block or 2 south of Alan Hale's restaurant. He, the skipper, of course, on Gilligan's Island. And just a couple of doors down is where A&M Studios is. It's actually a compound. You have to go through a gate to get in, and you have to have clearance to get in. And I didn't have a press pass, but I talked my way into the press conference the day after the afternoon after the session. But Jerry Moss was the M at A&M Records, and he died today at age 88, and the tributes are pouring in from all of the many successful pop and rock acts that he had a hand in propelling to the top. So we'll miss Jerry Moss. And the people in Hawaii, I guess, are going to miss Nora O'Donnell. She's already jetted out. She jetted in as this thing we call anchors away, the notion that a network can't adequately cover a major story like Maui without sending the anchor there. And normally I would criticize that, but not in the case of Nora O'Donnell. We were singing her praises the other day on the Radioactive Take, and we'll continue to. She's head and shoulders above her competition there on the evening newscasts, and we were glad to see her coverage augmenting the overall CBS news coverage there in Maui. But she's back in Washington just in time to catch up to the Trump story, which is snowballing, as you may have noticed. This thing in this latest indictment of the four here there in Georgia, this may be very problematic for Mr. Trump in terms of not interrupting his presidential ambitions this election season. So we'll see how that goes as time goes on here on the Radioactive Take. I said there were a couple of music names that died on the 16th of August. Jerry Moss today, and back in 1977, much more famously, Elvis Presley. You remember that, of course. And I've got a couple of words to say about it in a few moments, but I thought I would introduce it by seemingly going off on one of those tangents Steibel is so famous for, and talk about Bill Murray. Now, what does Bill Murray have to do with Elvis Presley, you might ask? Well, this. I don't know if you realize it, but fans of David Letterman certainly do, that David Letterman and Bill Murray have a special sort of a relationship that has manifested itself in the fact that every talk show that Letterman has had, Murray's been the first guest on. And I'm not just talking about Late Night with David Letterman and then the subsequent Late Show with David Letterman over there on CBS. I'm talking about the morning show Letterman had. It was just called the David Letterman Show, and it was only on for a few months there in the summer of, I guess it started in the spring and continued into the summer of 1980. But it didn't last long because it was a morning show on NBC. And Letterman's humor is not the sort of thing that most housewives who are tuned in at that hour are accustomed to seeing. They're more attuned to the soap operas and game shows that the networks offer in the mornings. But there was Letterman doing his Letterman style of comedy and booking a lot of interesting guests, including some of the earliest appearances of Andy Kaufman there on that morning show. But the very first guest on that morning show for NBC was Bill Murray. And then sure enough, when the suits at NBC Entertainment got their heads straight and decided that, hey, maybe Letterman really is a late night act, not a morning act, and they put him in the slot after Carson, and it didn't take long for that show to catch on, for the very good reason it was a fantastic show, much better than the later show at CBS, much better, for a host of reasons that I could list right here and now, but I don't have the airtime, so we'll reserve that for a later edition of the Radioactive Take. But suffice it to say that that Letterman's first guest was, again, Bill Murray on the Late Night with David Letterman show, and then the Late Show with David Letterman on CBS after he didn't get the Carson gig. That went to Jay Leno, as you'll recall. So Letterman, embittered, struck a deal with CBS and jumped to CBS. And once again, Bill Murray was the first guest on Late Show with David Letterman from the Ed Sullivan Theater. Same stage that the Beatles debuted on that magical Sunday night in February 9th, 1964. And I remember the date because I remember every moment of that Beatles' first appearance. In fact, I remember every moment of all 3 weeks. They were on for 3 consecutive weeks there in February, first on the 9th and then on the 16th, and adding 7 to 16, I guess you get 23. On the 23rd of February, they were not live. They were live from down here in Florida, but way down there in Florida, way south of me, down in Miami, is where the second week on the Sullivan Show was done. And that was a live remote from a hotel that was recently demolished down in Miami. And that's too bad. When I first got to Florida, that was one of the first sights I saw because I wanted to see the hotel where they did their thing that second week on the Sullivan Show. And I did. It was the Duval, or Duville, I guess it's pronounced. It's a French name. Hotel. It's not the Fontainebleau. It's not the one everybody thinks of and remembers from Goldfinger and from that Jerry Lewis film, The Bell Boy, or was it The Bellhop? I think it was The Bell Boy. Those were filmed at the Fontainebleau, which is about 3 times the size of the Duville, and it's about 3 or 4 miles south in Miami Beach there, the Fontainebleau is. But where the Beatles played is a little north on the same side of the road on, I guess, Collins, the main drag down there in Miami Beach. That's where the Beatles played that second week. And then the third week, people like myself watching at home in St. Louis, we thought we were watching the Beatles again live the third time, when in fact what Sullivan was doing was playing a tape that had been made the afternoon of their first appearance on February 9th, before a different audience, by the way. It was still dominated by screaming teenage girls, but it was a different audience that were screaming the evening of February 9th, that Sunday. So the third appearance was kind of phony baloney because it wasn't live. They didn't announce it wasn't live either. They could have mentioned that. Sullivan could have mentioned that, but he didn't want to spoil the magic of the moment and reveal the truth that the Beatles were already back in England by the time he was playing that tape the third week. But anyway, Letterman and Murray have this special relationship, as I say. And it was on a much later edition of Late Show with David Letterman, the CBS program, that I'm thinking of here, and that is serving as an introduction to my discussion of Presley. But what does Elvis Presley have to do with Bill Murray or David Letterman? Well, this. About 2, maybe 3 years before Letterman's retirement at CBS, Murray was making one of his, at least every year, maybe even twice a year, he would guest on Letterman. And typically what he would do before he'd sit down with Dave, he'd come out and do a little shtick, maybe sing a verse or two of a song or do a little dance or something. And then he would sit down, and that's what he did this particular appearance on Late Show with David Letterman on CBS. And I don't even remember what he did, but I remember what happened after he sat down. Because Letterman said, "Well, good to see you again there, Bill. Thanks for doing the show again. And we'll talk about whatever we're going to talk about when we get to it. But before that, I got to clear something up because somebody told me something that I just wanted to get it straight from the horse's mouth and confirm this. Somebody told me, Bill, that you were in attendance at Elvis Presley's funeral back in 1977? And Murray says, "Yeah, that's right. Why do you ask?" And Letterman says, "Well, because that was an event of such cultural significance that it's the kind of thing that all kinds of people would wish they had done. And some people would even claim they had taken the trouble to get to Memphis for it, but been lying about it. But you actually did it. And I think that's just tremendous. And meanwhile, I'm at home watching on TV, and I'm jumping up and down saying, 'Hey, Dave, what about me?' Because I was at Elvis Presley's funeral, too. Although I may not have had to go through the trouble that Murray described, because after Letterman brought it up, he said, by the way, it wasn't easy to get there. There were no flights to Memphis because all kinds of people were converging from all over the United States, maybe even from Europe, to get to Memphis for the funeral. And the funeral was held lickety-split. I figured it was going to be held on the weekend. Presley died about midnight Monday night, and then the news broke Tuesday afternoon, and I figured the funeral would be on Saturday or maybe Friday, which turned out to be the day, by the way, that Groucho Marx died, but hardly anybody noticed, just like few people noticed when Mother Teresa died right after Diana, in that week when all the news was Diana 24/7. Well, so did hardly anybody notice Groucho Marx dying on the Friday after Presley died on Monday night, or maybe even Tuesday morning. It's not clear that it was after midnight that Presley expired on, because he was in the bathroom and he was locked in there, or at least with the door closed, and his girlfriend was just letting him do whatever he was doing in the bathroom, and didn't check in on him until, I guess she said, Elvis, and didn't hear anything. And then, only then, did she go into the bathroom and find him having collapsed off of the toilet. But the funeral was not scheduled for the weekend or even the Friday. The funeral was scheduled for Thursday, and the news only broke on Tuesday afternoon. But I was in St. Louis, so I figured, hey, I'm only 5 hours from Memphis, so let's go down there. Unfortunately, both of the cars in my family were spoken for those couple of days, so I couldn't take one of the cars down to Memphis for a couple of days, so I had to find somebody else to get me down there. So I called up a couple of rock and roll friends of mine and convinced them that this was something not to be missed. I said, this is not just another funeral. This is not just another rock funeral. This is something people are going to be talking about for a long time. And of course they have in the subsequent decades. And I talked to these two friends of mine. They were people that were helping me on the Dylan magazine, Zimmerman Blues. And I said, look, all four Beatles are probably going to show up for this thing. And do we want to miss the reuniting of the Beatles? Even if they're not performing, just seeing them in one place at the same time is something that's going to make this of special significance. And what about Dylan? He'll probably be there. So I persuaded these guys into going down there with me. And Ken Thomas, he provided the car. Ken Thomas is a highly respected journalist who's been ailing in recent years in St. Louis, and we hope he gets better real soon. But he wrote up our visit to Memphis for the funeral, and it's available online somewhere. I'm not sure where you can find it, but he's easy to find because his name is spelled with two N's, Ken Thomas, and he wrote about it. So just search Presley Funeral and Ken Thomas, and you'll probably find the lengthy essay that he wrote, and which he tells me is going to be part of his autobiography that he's writing now, Ken is. So that'll be interesting to see that in print. But in the meantime, you can read it in print or in text at least, here on the internet, and I would encourage you to do so. So now I'll give you a short version of the adventures we had down there. We drove down there with great expectation, hardly any of which was realized because none of the four Beatles were there. Mick Jagger wasn't there. Keith Richards wasn't there. And Dylan wasn't there. And in fact, I only saw two celebrities, and I know how to spot celebrities. It's kind of a hobby of mine. We've been talking about that on previous editions of the Radioactive Take, and we'll continue talking about it because that's what I like to do, one of the things I like to do. And I figured I'd have a chance to shake the hands of some famous people there, except that there were hardly any. I only spotted, and I was looking the whole time, combing the crowd, watching the limos as people got out of them, and there's only two celebrities that I saw. One would be Anne Margaret Olsen, I guess is her full name, but she dropped the Olsen and then added a hyphen between the Anne and the Margaret, her middle name, and became Anne Margaret, and then would co-star with Presley, of course, in probably his most celebrated film. That was Viva Las Vegas, I guess. And George Hamilton was also there. I don't know what his connection to Presley is, but he made the funeral, and we got to see him in person, but nobody else. Well, nobody else of a celebrity sort. We got to meet Joe Esposito. He was Presley's road manager for many years, and we got our way into a press conference that they held, I guess, the day after the funeral. And we got to meet and hang with Joe Esposito there. And I got to meet Chet Flippo. Now, you probably don't know who Chet Flippo is. He's now deceased, but for many years he was one of the most respected writers at Rolling Stone. And we actually hung with him for a couple hours, Ken Thomas and I did. Well, maybe it was 1 hour, but it was still a thrill to be in his presence. He's one of the most respected rock critics of all time. Although he specialized in country and jazz, I do believe, more than rock. But Chet Flippo was there, as was Anne Margaret and George Hamilton. But that was about it when it came to famous names. And that's too bad because, and not just too bad for us being able to see him and maybe even meet him, but too bad for Presley. Don't you think that Presley would have attracted dozens of major Hollywood and music industry folk? I was expecting that, but again, that expectation was not realized. But it was fascinating watching something like 500,000 people congregate there in Memphis that week in August of 1977. And by the way, we were talking the other day on the Radioactive Take about Levon Helm. He was the drummer. Met him a couple of times and listened to him hundreds of times as the drummer and I think the best vocalist in the band, Dylan's backup group. And I saw Levon Helm perform with the band and Dylan in 1974 and saw him perform with one or two members of the band in the years subsequent to their breaking up after The Last Waltz, the film that was made by Martin Scorsese out there in San Francisco, with, again, Mr. Dylan and a lot of other famous folk, including the late Robbie Robertson, who we talked about last week here on the Radioactive Take in the wake of his unexpected passing. And the reason I bring up Levon Helm again, aside from the fact that he's pretty close to my favorite drummer in rock and roll, with maybe the exception of Pick Withers, another guy who played behind Dylan. He's the one that's on that Slow Train Coming album with Dylan, and he's best remembered as the first drummer, the original drummer for Dire Straits, Mark Knopfler's band. But he quit early on, and that's too bad because Knopfler needs him. Knopfler needs a good drummer, and he had maybe the best drummer in all of rock in Pick Withers. But Withers has been laying low over in Europe in recent decades, and that's too bad because, again, he's, I think, my favorite drummer, and with a close second from Levon Helm. But why am I talking about Levon Helm amid all this Presley stuff? Well, because Levon Helm, who was also an actor, he's the coal miner in Coal Miner's Daughter. We're trying to say Loretta. We're going to try to say it until we get it right. Loretta Lynn, who was, I guess, portrayed by Sissy Spacek in the movie, Coal Miner's Daughter. Levon Helm played the coal miner, the father of Loretta Lynn. That time we got it right. And he's been in a few other films, including The Right Stuff. But he was recruited to be the narrator of what, for my money, is the best of the many Presley documentaries I've seen. There must be 6 or 7 or 8 Elvis Presley documentaries, rockumentaries, if you will. But the very best of them, in my view, was narrated by Mr. Helm and is entitled Elvis 56, with an apostrophe there before the 56, because it's about what I guess in Latin would be called his annus mirabilis, his miracle year of 1956. I'm a critic of Presley's, actually. I was recognizing enough of his import that I wasn't going to miss his funeral, but I'm a serious critic of most all of his work post 1958. That's when he was drafted and spent 2 years in the Army over there in Germany. And when he came back, he wasn't the same Elvis, not by a long shot. Sinatra had a special on NBC, I guess, that reintroduced him to the American public there in 1960. But already he was dressing not like a rock and roller, but like a businessman in fancy suits, and had tamed his act to the point where it was hardly rock and roll anymore. It was pretty much pop. And when people think of Presley these days, they think of, well, when I think of Presley, I think of the funeral, of course. But when most people think of Presley, they think of Presley in the jumpsuit on the stage in Vegas or touring the United States. He never toured Europe, and there's reasons for that. We'll explain why he never got to Europe, at least to perform. He got there for the Army, but he never performed in Europe, and there's a very good reason for that, and we'll try to fill you in on that on one of these editions of the Radioactive Take down the road. But anyway, 1956 was his year. He got started in 54, actually a little earlier, but professionally he got started in 54 and got really rolling in 55, but hit the zenith of his recording work in 1956, as well as his touring work. And that's what this Elvis 56 documentary chronicles, with first-rate narration but understated narration, with that wonderful Southern accent that Levon Helm had. He was from Arkansas, I guess, that Levon Helm was. As was the leader of the first band he was in that brought him to the attention of the guys up in Canada that became the band. That would be Ronnie Hawkins, who fronted a group called Ronnie Hawkins and the Hawks, which would eventually incorporate these guys from Canada, Rick Danko and Richard Manuel and Garth Hudson. And then they became the band, capital T, capital B. But Levon was working on his own when narrating this Elvis 56 documentary. And again, I would encourage you to find it. I do believe it's on YouTube on an adjacent channel. But don't change it just yet, because we're not quite wrapped yet. But I did want to tell you about those experiences we had in Memphis. And again, it wasn't what we had hoped it would be, because there just weren't that many big names in attendance. And you got to wonder how Presley's survivors felt about that. I would have thought a lot more. I mean, why wasn't Sinatra there? But he wasn't. But Steibel was, and Bill Murray was, and maybe you were too. But if not, at least you were there vicariously through this little edition of the Radioactive Take at WBQS Radio, a station that doesn't exist, but maybe one day will. But in the meantime, it's on YouTube, as I will be tomorrow for the Thursday edition of the Radioactive Take. Hope you can make it. Until then, so long from Florida.